Do you shake and dribble uncontrollably at the sight of an overweight man playing a technical and complicated guitar solo? Do you enjoy feeling physically sick when viewing the album cover of your favourite band? Is your hair so impressively long, sweaty and greasy that you have caused multiple injuries whilst headbanging at concerts? Well, it seems like death metal is the perfect genre for you, and quickly, just before we continue, make sure you call me a poser in the comments, it really does hurt my feelings. Death metal isn't an extreme subgenre of heavy metal. Nah, I'm kidding, of course, it's extreme. Only somewhat though, don't get too carried away, never get too silly. Death metal typically uses heavily distorted, low-tuned guitars. It has to sound heavy enough to make up for the lack of testosterone that typically characterises many of the fans of death metal. What remains relatively unique for death metal when it comes to guitars is the intricacy of many of the techniques and riffs employed by the musicians. Palm muting and tremolo picking are utilised to produce technically proficient riffs and solos. If you don't know what either of those techniques are, palm muting consists of the player smashing their hand on the guitar like a caveman, forcing the guitar to play itself out of pure fear, and tremolo picking is essentially just giving yourself arthritis. Guitarists are further forced to suffer trying to play this genre, as many death metal songs feature abrupt tempo, key and time signature changes. Due to this, the average death metal guitarist looks like this. Moving on to drums, the average death metal drummer looks like this, and essentially just smashes their drum kit as fast as humanly possible, changing tempo whenever they please. You have to remember, it isn't a mistake if a horde of nerdy fans think it's on purpose and dribble at the thought of it. They also have incredibly strong calves due to their usage of the double kick. Let's move on to vocals. I think the most accurate representation of death metal vocals is this video.
You may got the sugar, but I got the mellow waiver.
Or alternatively, suck really hard on a Capri Sun. You'll pretty much achieve the same thing. If you want to do the same old and use your actual voice to achieve the vocals, essentially just growl. Growl as deep as you possibly can. Keep growling and just hope you're able to sing in 10 years. How else are you going to release your mediocre acoustic solo project? Oh yeah, I almost forgot bass guitar. Essentially just follow the root notes of the main riff and pray to whatever dark and edgy creature you believe in that you'll be able to hear a single note through the wall of distortion, drums and Capri Sun straw ambience. Lyrical themes are pretty disgusting. Topics can range from politics to sci-fi, as long as it puts a horrific image in your head. As it's death metal, unfortunately you'll never be able to understand a single word, as it all sounds like. You'll just have to look up the lyrics online and pretend you understood them originally for internet points and self-assurance. One thing I also want to quickly cover is the album covers of death metal. Upon viewing a cover, you'll either see a beautifully drawn piece of art or one of the most vile, abhorrent images that would immediately get you banned from most social medias. Of course, death metal just emerged from a lack of friends and far too much free time, but how did that actually emerge? What's the actual history? To find that out, you can either research it yourself or listen to me absolutely butcher it. As is the same for pretty much all metal, it wouldn't really exist without Black Sabbath. That's pretty obvious, to be honest. I'm only mentioning it because I really enjoy this video. A pioneer that's more akin to the future sound of death metal, among other subgenres such as black and thrash metal, is Venom. Venom will combine an aggressive sound with harsh vocals and strong satanic imagery, mainly inspiring black metal, but death metal also kind of has elements of black metal. To be honest, if you played all these different subgenres to anyone with an actual social life, they wouldn't know the difference and would just look very confused. Another band that was key to the early development of death metal was Slayer. Slayer's style of thrash metal was a lot more violent than their contemporaries at the time, combining a breakneck speed and technical prowess with lyricism that focused on, you guessed it, death. Both these bands would be cited as an influence to what is seen by many as the pioneers of death metal, Possessed, who would blend elements of black and thrash metal, pushing the conventions of both genres to their absolute limit. Bassist and vocalist Jeff Pescara would write what would go on to be the first Possessed song in 1979 at the age of 11, eventually forming the band in 1983. Possessed would immediately focus all their efforts on playing faster, heavier and nastier than any of their contemporaries. They saw Slayer scaring and shocking people and wanted to achieve the same and more. Around this time, Possessed would actually coin the name death metal by simply just writing a song called death metal. October 1985 would see the release of their debut album Seven Churches, which combined prominent satanic imagery with a blistering speed and focus on technical riffs and solos. After releasing a few well-received projects in the coming years, some of which focusing more so on thrash metal than death metal, the band would split in 1987 due to internal tensions. Not only is Jeff Pescara commonly seen as the creator of death metal, he is also an incredibly inspiring person. In 1989, Jeff would be involved in a mugging, where he was shot from close range. The bullet paralysed him from the chest down. The lack of mobility led to alcohol and drug issues, which continued until he got sober, thanks to a focus on education. Since then, Pescara has continued to be a prominent figure within the extreme metal scene, as well as achieving a degree in labour studies, attending law school, and actually recently walking for the first time. Moving back to death metal, the aptly named Death would form in 1983, releasing their first demo, Death by Metal, in 1984. You see, early death metal had some incredibly creative and forward-thinking thinking project names. This tape, alongside other releases by the band, would circulate around the scene, cementing the name in the mind of these motherfuckers. Death's 1987 debut album, Scream Bloody Gore, has been commonly described as the evolution from thrash to death metal by people who probably haven't heard of Possessed. Scream Bloody Gore would take the influence of thrash and death and push it to its absolute extreme, playing faster riffs with more distortion in a lower tuning, essentially just taking everything developed before and saying, "F it, let's add a little bit more." And just like that, a scene blossomed, a scene focusing entirely on pushing everything to its limit. It became a driving factor for many in the genre. Everyone wanted to one-up each other. This reached ridiculous lengths, with bands such as The Aside going full mayhem and throwing dead animals into the crowd. Death metal would spread to Sweden in the late 80s with bands like Carnage and Entombed. Of course, because of our herd mentality, a feud between fans of Norwegian black metal and Swedish death metal formed, with fights breaking out at many of the shows. This even extended to a Molotov attempt at a Deicide show in Stockholm. 1989 would see the formation of Morbid Angel, who pushed death metal even further, not just musically but lyrically as well. Their debut album, Altars of Madness, would push the envelope so far it redefined what it meant to even be heavy, and laid the groundwork to what would eventually become brutal death metal. Around this time, death metal was beginning to struggle, not in the traditional sense though. It was as popular as ever. It was the live shows that were seeing a hit. This was due to much of the violence that was occurring at the shows, resulting in many bands being forced to play in some very strange locations. This continued until the offers were too lucrative to refuse for the venues, and as death metal continued to skyrocket in popularity, shows became more common. What is surprising about the mainstream attention of death metal is the band that became the most popular. The band that quite literally has some of the most disgusting album art I've ever seen. Cannibal Corpse. Cannibal Corpse would form in 1988 and move to Tampa, Florida in 1994. The extreme heat alongside their air conditioner made the band's practicing sessions complete hell, being described by the bassist as smelling like rat shit. This seemed to inspire the music, as to be honest, if I were to use a type of feces to describe Cannibal Corpse's music, it would probably be of the rat variety. The band would focus heavily on the production side of the music. They felt although much of metal in the past was good, it suffered when it came to the production, often sounded messy. Although Cannibal Corpse is extremely heavy, it all sat in the mix comfortably, making it more appealing to the hardcore fans. Cannibal Corpse would also focus on making their song titles and lyricism as disgusting as possible. What's surprising about this is the fact that the lyrics pale in comparison to the album art in terms of depravity. Just have a Google. YouTube will not let me show any of these. Of course, this led to some juicy controversy for the band, with multiple American politicians campaigning to essentially deplatform the band due to the violent lyricism and album art. This was one-upped by Australia and Germany, who actually banned the sale of any Cannibal Corpse music. Despite this, they would become very successful and actually have one of their songs featuring Ace Ventura: Pet Detective. Death metal has continued to delve into so many subgenres and styles, it's probably fit for a full video, so watch out for that. If you want a quick summary, essentially death metal has continued to push forward the genre by becoming increasingly more technical, with many bands within the genre essentially just flexing their guitar skills for money. The birth and rise of death metal tells a similar tale to many extreme genres of music. The bar can always be pushed further, and death metal has definitely achieved this. Whether it be the music, lyrics, imagery or album art, bands within the subgenre have always strived to push it to its absolute limit, which pisses off many individuals who look like this, but remains an interesting and refreshing genre for fans of the more extreme side of music. And to be fair, although they really did try their best, they managed to avoid being as degenerate as black metal, which can only be seen as a positive in my eyes.